Hi, I'm Brian Schroff from Beyondware. We've just released version 2.3 of Beyond Typicals. With this new version, we've made some license management updates to our website and can now offer enterprise licensing. So if you're interested in a group subscription at your organization, please reach out to us using the Contact Us page on our website. We've also added a bunch of new 3D assets and are up to over 400 available for your use in Beyond Typicals, including our new emissive lights to create a nighttime scene. I've also created 10 new example projects that I'm excited to share with you. Let's check them out. We've added over 50 new assets to Beyond Typicals 2.3. We're now up to over 400 assets. I'll give you a tour of these new ones here at the bottom of the list. Everything after this abutment 2 is new to version 2.3. So we've got some street furniture options like this bike share station and some table and chairs options. We've also got a recycle bin and a trash can, a couple of mailbox options. We've also got a couple new bus stop shelters and bus stop benches. We've got a yellow sand barrel and a nice large palm tree. We've also got a blank road sign on a mast arm and an empty billboard that you could add a custom label to with a transparent background if you wanted to put text on front of those, or you could just leave them blank. We also had a user request stairs, so we put a few different stair pieces in the list as well. We've also got some new static pedestrians. So we've got a person in a wheelchair and a person holding a cane. These aren't moving pedestrians, so you wouldn't be able to add these yet to the walking pedestrians down a sidewalk, but we do have them as static options that you can put into screenshot renderings to show ADA accessibility in your project. We've also got a couple of cranes for construction equipment. We have that smaller crane crawler and then a much larger crane truck. And then we've got a whole bunch of new buildings. I'll give you a tour of those and bring those in here, starting with our townhomes. We've got a few different options. So you'll see these townhomes do have these kind of concrete pad driveways. If you don't want to see those for any reason, you can always just grab that asset and lower it until that driveway is hidden beneath the surface of the model. We've also got some specialty buildings here, including a new tall urban building and a fast food restaurant with a drive-through, a fire department, a gas station, and a post office. Then we've also got quite a few new single-family homes. You'll see we try to vary up some textures and styles and sizes of these houses, and you'll see that some have garages and others do not. And we've also got some apartment buildings as well. One thing I want to note about some of these urban buildings is they may not appear true to size when you have a sidewalk with walking pedestrians next to it. If that's ever the case, it's a pretty simple edit here to just go ahead and change the scale up by a factor of 2 or more, depending on what that building looks like next to the pedestrians. I usually pay particular attention to a pedestrian walking next to the doorway to make sure that that looks like a realistic height. So just something to pay attention to as you use some urban buildings so that you don't lay them all out in your model and then have to start upsizing them and moving them around. And then I want to note that I'm using some of these newer assets in some of the example projects that you might already be familiar with. So when you get a chance, I'd recommend diving into the list of example projects and look at some of those ones higher in the list, and you might see some of these new assets there as well. Finally, the last assets I wanted to point out are some cool new emissive lights that you can place into your model, which can help visualize a nighttime scene. I'll add a caveat here that these lights aren't necessarily scientific or programmable. So in an instance where someone may see a nighttime lighting example and ask for photometric calculations, these aren't that scientific and don't have much more control over them than choosing a strong, a medium, or a dim type of light. So right now there's no additional controls or analysis for things like color temperature or glare control or foot candle measurements. It's just a new visualization option for a nighttime scene. I'll also note that these lights can demand some additional workload from your computer, so it's similar to our 3D ryegrass, where if you add a bunch of them into the model, it can slow down your frame rate and make things look a little choppy. That said, as I move this light around, you can see how it works with reflectivity and casting shadows through the model. We do have a new Streetcar example project that has been set up with one model phase that uses these lights, which I'll show later in the video. But I'll remind you that it would be on the user to change the environment settings like I did, like changing the background colors to black and setting the time of day to somewhere around midnight or 24 on the spin bar. So, a few of the new example projects in Beyond Typicals 2.3 are geared more toward informational or educational communication of a roadway improvement. This angled parking options example is one of those. You'll see here I've got two different models that show front-in and back-in angled parking alternatives, and I've used some custom labeling and placed assets to demonstrate the pros and cons of each of those parking configurations. For instance, the front-in angled parking option is a more conventional way to park on the road. They're more common and they're easier and faster to enter the parking space, but they also have some pretty poor visibility for a driver trying to leave the parking lane. Plus, children that are leaving the rear of the vehicle are pointed toward moving traffic based on how the door swings open, and trunk access is less safe for the person as they are closer to that moving traffic as well. And then the back-end angled parking is basically just the reverse of those. There's a lot higher safety benefit to this configuration, but it's more unconventional, and there could be a few potential downsides to just implementing this without some conversation and evaluation because of that. So that's why I put this example together, to show you that you can use Beyond Typicals to help communicate some new or unconventional road improvements to stakeholders and decision makers to help come to a resolution. So I'll show you how this was made. We have just a simple parking lane with rotated cars. I've also added a secondary asset of a stripe long to show a painted stripe between those cars. I've also added curb stops as a repeating asset behind those vehicles, which I placed in this adjacent sidewalk off to the side. So you'll see we have a primary asset of a walking pedestrian and a secondary asset of parking curb, which I've just adjusted the spacing and rotation to match those parked vehicles. And then I just use the external horizontal offset to push those left away from the sidewalk section, and then the vertical offset to lower those down to the street elevation. Then you'll see I've got some placed pedestrians here to communicate those safety benefits like trunk access and the child's directionality when leaving the car. And then I've also placed a custom label to indicate a motorist's cone of vision. I put this as a tip in our LinkedIn user group, so if you're not yet a member of that group, we do have this online community resource, which you can request to join and see some tips like this as we develop them. But basically, this is a semi-transparent triangle, which is just a large custom label that's stretched out very long and wide. I'll go ahead and edit this label to show some of those characteristics. You'll see it has a very large top leader line width and a very large Z offset. I've also set the alpha transparency value very low to get that transparent look to it. And as I make it more opaque, you'll start to see what those individual components are of the label, where you'll see that really wide top leader line and that long Z offset, and that the label has just been rotated in the X direction so that it's parallel to the ground. So as I bring that rotation back up to 0 and start transforming this back down to a more conventional size, you'll see in kind of a reverse engineered fashion how I used that custom label as the vision cone. Another one of the informational example projects is this bike lane curb solution example. And you'll see here this is a fairly simple model with some duplicate sections and an invisible section between them. Each side has a lane of traffic, a parking lane that's floating away from the curb, and some curbside bike lanes. On the left here is a pretty common problem in urban areas where a city might put in these white flexible delineators, which do a good job demarcating the bike lanes, but don't do a great job protecting them. And it's not uncommon where a car or delivery vehicle will either drive over the top of those or weave between them and block the bike lanes, which can be pretty dangerous for cyclists. So you'll see that these are just bike lanes where I've turned off the bike traffic to show that cyclists can't move around that parked car, which is a placed asset. And then on this side over here, you'll see I've got some custom labels indicating a potential solution to the problem, and put in some curb stops and stretch them out to basically show some raised concrete protection, which can actually deter vehicles from moving over into the bike lanes. I've also used 2 of these curb stops to show that you can add gaps between those to make sure any stormwater runoff from rain falling on the street can make its way to a low point in the road and get to an existing inlet or catch basin in the curb and gutter, so that you don't have to rebuild your roadway pavement and move drainage structures and sewer laterals to quickly add some physical protection for those curbside bike lanes. And here is our bus stop crash risk example project, which is another of our informational or educational examples to show you can use Beyond Typicals to communicate a safety issue and a potential improvement for, in this case, a multiple threat crash risk, which specifically is the threat of a pedestrian being struck on a multi-lane road because one of the vehicles has stopped for a pedestrian while blocking their visibility to the next lane over. So as they begin to cross the road, traffic in that adjacent lane, whether it's a bike lane or common lane, may not have time to stop or avoid a collision with a crossing pedestrian that they couldn't see for most of their approach to the crosswalk. So in this model, I'm using static pedestrians and a static bus and another vision cone that I showed in the angled parking example to show that the vision of the pedestrian is pretty well blocked by a stopped bus, and they could experience the crash risk as they begin to cross the road. And in the second model, I've got an alternative of that same roadway width where instead of a parking lane / bus pull-off area along the curb and a bike lane on the inside edge of that, I've moved the parking away from the curb and placed a bus boarding island in the width of that parking lane. I've also moved the bike lane to a protected position on the outside along the curb. So in this configuration, instead of pulling out of the travel lane, the buses would stop in lane, and now the pedestrian doesn't need to look for moving traffic in another lane on their left. They can focus their attention on the oncoming traffic from the other direction when a bus is stopped. Here's our bike lane locations alternative project. This is a bit similar to an earlier example project with guardrail options, but I wanted to create this to show some of the various ways you can protect a bike lane along a roadway. For instance, by raising the bike lane higher than street level or protecting it with curb. So this is just a few different ways to show some bike lanes. Obviously, there are a lot more protected bikeway solutions depending on the project and the area you're working in, but you could use this as a starting point for your particular bike project. Some unique things about this, for starters, is the camera view. You'll see under the rendering tool, I've preloaded this with a couple of saved cameras. This is the free front camera, where I've set a really low field of view, which helps capture all 4 of these options at the same time. And then there's also a pan front camera, which has a higher field of view, and you'll see has already saved a right pan motion to the camera as it moves along the front edge of the model to show all 4 of those options. So that could be really nice for recording a video of the model. I also want to point out I've done some custom pavement texturing. So you'll see there's the brick herringbone 3 texture, which I've also added a reddish hue to it to give a different natural brick look. And then I've also added some custom labels throughout. In the front of the model, I've placed some labels with a completely transparent background. You can see what that looks like when we make it less transparent, but by setting that background value all the way to 0 and moving that label to the front edge and down, plus change the font to yellow to contrast a bit more with the earth layer behind it, that can give you a bit different look for labeling different options or stages if you're looking for unique ways to label your sections. I'm also using other types of custom labels, for instance, calling out special curbs and this detectable edge, which can be placed along the side of a sidewalk to make sure that blind pedestrians don't encroach into a directly adjacent bike lane. Or you could show mountable curbs where you're putting a bike lane at an intermediate level between the road and sidewalk. And then I've also showed some mountable curbs on the side of a street-level bike lane. These are a good alternative to your typical barrier curb, as they're a bit easier for errant cyclists to mount and dismount without getting knocked over. And finally, I've got a custom label here that's been rotated parallel to the ground and placed directly on top of the bike lane to show the desirable maintenance clearance width. I live in the Midwest, so snow clearance is always a consideration for curb-separated bike lanes so that they're wide enough for city maintenance vehicles to come through and clear that path in the winter. This is the one-way streetcar example project, and I've built in a lot of unique features to this one to create a very unique scene. For starters, you'll see I have a streetcar lane where I have moving traffic as well as a tram populated in that lane. And I can do that by using a tram section from our section list, but by also toggling on use global traffic so that I can populate a few passenger cars that would be randomized along with that tram. You'll notice in the common lane next to it, I haven't toggled on use global traffic so that I can keep the vehicle settings customized just to that lane. So the use global traffic toggle can come in handy for some very unique traffic situations where you might be looking to add in moving traffic that's more than just a library of passenger vehicles. Then moving to the left side, you'll see I've got a building small section, but I've spaced out the multifamily buildings that are the primary asset so that I could add a church and a cafe building between them. Then you'll see plenty of other placed assets like planter boxes, flowers, and outdoor seating next to those buildings. As I select this parkway section, you'll see it's just a sidewalk section with some trees and tree grates instead of the walking pedestrians. Plus, I've added a bunch of placed assets here. Our new bike share station asset, a light, a bus shelter, some more benches, static pedestrians, and then a bunch of detectable warning tiles for the length of the streetcar platform bump out. I thought a lot of these looked better than just one or two of these tiles stretched out, so it was worth the time to position these into place. One tip is that once you establish a consistent spot for an asset like this, take note of the coordinate that would remain consistent. In this case, the Y coordinate is 333, so that you can make sure the rest of those are set to that horizontal position as well. Then the next section in is a parking lane with the static vehicles turned off, and you'll see a few more placed assets in this one. That includes a couple of elongated sidewalk pieces that are also sitting over the top of a couple of mid-block curb bump outs, and those sidewalk pieces just hide the ramps and other ends of those assets to create that long bump out platform. Then moving to the right side of the road, you'll see I went kind of crazy with repeating assets. The parking lane has static vehicles, but they're spaced out so there's a car in every other space. I've also added a stripe short as a secondary asset to this lane, which I positioned to be the perpendicular white stripes between those spaces. Then just left of that parking lane, I've got a 0-foot wide invisible section so that I could add some more repeating assets for that parking lane. In this case, it's another stripe short, but shrunk in the X direction and rotated and positioned at the end of those perpendicular stripes to make kind of a T marking between those parking spaces. Then the parkway on the right just has trees and tree grates as assets, and then the sidewalk with walking pedestrians. But to the right of that, I've put in a curb and also added the old barrier asset to that section to create a short wall with a railing between that sidewalk and the park. Then just to the right of that curb, I've got another 0-foot wide invisible section with a street light and parking meter as primary and secondary assets, which I pushed over to the left using the external horizontal offset slider. Then in this park, you'll see I've got a cut slope and then a bunch of flat slopes, which I've used to place some 3D dry fescue grass assets, plus some various randomly spaced bushes and trees in there as well. And obviously I've used assets that resemble more of a fall scene, so less green and more brown through there. One thing I'll highlight here is on this cut slope, I've rotated the 3D grass in the Y direction, and then use the vertical offset to bring it down to match the slope of that surface. Then way back in the corner, you'll see I placed our new billboard asset as well. And now in the second model, which is called Night with Lights, I'll show you that I've placed some of our new emissive light assets, which are new to version 2.3, and show you how those can represent a nighttime scene for your typical section. For starters, in version 2.3, I'll note the environment settings are a global setting for your model. So if you do want to create a daytime and nighttime option in your model, you would need to change the time of day and gradient colors to really achieve that nighttime look. So here you'll see I've set the time of day to 24 or midnight, and then I'll need to change this blue background by knocking these inner and outer gradients down to black. So there, now we've got an actual nighttime scene, and comparing that to the daytime model with those environmental changes and no emissive lights, you can see how adding in those lights when you make those environmental changes, you can achieve that nighttime scene look. Something I do want to note, if you do add a lot of these lights into your model, it can slow down your frame rate. So this is getting a bit choppy on my machine as I'm recording. I can check my frame rate in the visibility settings. There, I'm down at about 9 or 10. I think if I closed a few programs and wasn't recording my screen, this would be performing a little bit better on my machine, but just keep that in mind that adding these can slow down the display frame rate. That said, if I did cut a rendered video of this model, it would produce a smooth video with a frame rate that I've input. It's not necessarily tied to the display frame rate of your program. So I'll give you a quick tour of these. You'll see that these light poles here and the street light on the left side appear to be emitting light, but those aren't. It's just placed 3D lights below those that I've put into the model. So it's not the light poles themselves giving off that light, it's these placeable assets that I've pulled into the model. We have generic light dim, generic light medium, and generic light strong as options to bring into the model to give off light. You can just simply drag and drop into your section and place them as you would any other 3D asset. So in this project, I basically pulled in some assets here. You'll see this is the generic light strong, and I basically put them just underneath where those light poles are positioned in the section. And then also over by this street light in this section, you'll see I've added 2 street lights. I was getting a weird shadow from just placing one, so I wanted to make sure that I put lights on both sides of that light pole. And again, check your coordinates. If you really want some consistency, it can help to line up. In this case, it might be the X coordinate so that they're positioned on the same length next to those light poles. And then finally, I also put a couple of lights out here just for flavor. Since I did put in that billboard, I've got some emissive lights sitting there on top of those lights in the billboard as well. So a really cool option to bring a different look to your typical section visualization. Like I said in the intro, there's not a lot of science or analysis to this lighting. It's really nothing more than just pulling in a dim, medium, or strong light and putting that in your model. But for now, this can create a really unique look, so I encourage you to try it out. Here's an example project called Bridge Replacement Staging. At first glance here, you'll see that I've got multiple phases to show an existing asphalt surface bridge with concrete girders, then a stage with that existing bridge demolished to its piers. The next stage shows the construction of pier caps on those existing piers, then the steel girder installation, then the deck placement, and finally the new bridge open to traffic. You'll see there's also water underneath, so in all these models, you will see a water plane in the section hierarchy. That water is essentially just a single 0-foot wide water plane section stuck in the middle of each phase with a single large water element toggled on and stretched out in the X direction and moved down to give the appearance the bridge is over water. For these middle stages where we only see part of the bridge structure, you'd know if you're familiar with Beyond Typical's bridges that you'd need to have placed bridge lanes and shoulders and other section types to be able to access a substructure menu to be able to put in those piers and pier caps and girders. So basically what I did to create this project was start by building the existing bridge, then the final bridge model. Then after that, I duplicated the final bridge phase a few times and place those higher in the phasing list to start peeling things away from it. That includes things like deleting striping and turning off assets like moving vehicles, plus changing the texture of all those section types to transparent. So you'll see in the texture menu, when I click reset to default, those bridge sections start to reappear. By doing this, I can make sure that the girders and pier caps and other substructure elements that I carefully placed in the final bridge model will appear in that same consistent position across all the previous construction stage models, where in those I can more easily toggle off labels and traffic and girders and leave those final bridge sections in place, just changed to an invisible texture. Doing it this way by removing things that are already there is just a lot less work than putting in new substructure elements on these middle phases. Here is a slide-in bridge construction example project. This one took substantially more effort to build than the last one, but you'll see there are quite a few more stages with a lot more complexity to them. In these, I've used area highlights and pathway arrows and temporary barriers to show staging with a partial demolition of an existing bridge, then installing some future permanent piers plus a temporary pier to build that permanent bridge off to the side. You'll see the deck starts to form on the right side, and then I move traffic over to that new partial deck and then demo the rest of the existing bridge on the west. Then I show the new bridge deck sliding to the left to its permanent position and continue to build the rest of the bridge. So you'll see that temporary pier is gone and our substructure comes together before placing that left half of the bridge and finally ending with the final bridge open to traffic. So then I can compare the original 4-lane bridge to the much larger 6-lane bridge with HOV lanes and bike lanes. In all of these phases, you'll notice there are similar transparent sections to the last example I discussed, where I left transparent pieces of that bridge in place to keep substructure elements as consistent as possible between stages. I'll note this did take a good amount of time to build, but mostly because I paid very close attention to the location of the girders and piers so that they remain in the same place between those stages as you navigate through them. You'll see in this 2D view that between stages, all of those substructure elements remain in the same spot, which can be challenging when you start to adjust lane widths and positions because those substructure elements are located relative to the width and position of the lane they're assigned to or beneath. So when a 6-foot wall section disappears or changes to a 12-foot lane, I needed to adjust the position of a lot of the substructure elements just to make sure they're in the same spot as I navigate through staging. So that said, I just wanted to show that something this complex is possible in Beyond Typicals and can be done in less than a day. Plus, I wanted to note that the 2D front view is very helpful for making sure those substructure elements are consistent between phases. I found myself going back to that view a lot. And then I'd also recommend trying to stay organized when using a lot of substructure elements like this. It can be helpful to jot down some notes on the side for which lanes have girders, which ones have piers, etc., just as an easy reference to go and find them and make any tweaks that might be needed down the road. Here is our cable-stayed bridge example project. You'll see right away I've added another water plane below the bridge. I can show that to you here in the section hierarchy. So that's right next to the center 32-inch barrier section. For this section, I just toggled on one of our larger water types and then set that external position as low as it will go and increase the X scale as wide as it will go just to make it a more expansive water plane below the bridge. And you'll see I'm using the cable bridge substructure type. I've placed that under the 32-inch barrier section so I can toggle that off and on to show that element. Again, if you use our cable bridge or arch bridge substructures, those work best for a longer section length, like 400 to 500 feet. Otherwise, it can look kind of scrunched up. So this section I've lengthened out and increased the volume of traffic in each of the lanes so that it shows more than one car drive down the length of a section at a time. Just a couple other notes. I'm using the old barrier asset as a primary asset along the outside curbs. This was a new bridge asset that we added in the last version of Beyond Typicals. I played with it a bit, including the X scaling and Z scaling and spacing of the asset, just to make sure it stretched out a little bit better for the longer section and had the height that I was looking for. And then I've also got a fence on the outside where I did some similar asset transformations, like increasing the y-axis scale and decreasing the z-axis scale to make it a bit shorter relative to the pedestrian height. Here is the low poly street example project. This one's a bit unique, but it's definitely one where I've heard over my career as a project manager that a too photorealistic rendering too early in a project can appear to some clients or stakeholders that a lot of effort went into it and therefore might have had all the decisions made, and there'd be no room for public feedback to be able to change any design decisions. So I just wanted to use this example project to show some of the features built into Beyond Typicals that you can use to show a more preliminary or simplistic visualization if it's desired. This model includes some low poly light poles that we have a couple different styles of, as well as a couple of low polygon trees. I'm also using our white generic buildings on the outside. And then I was searching for something to capture a non-photorealistic surface and played with some of the texture options and settled on this glow texture, which by default is set for our right-of-way lines. So if you were to insert any of these right-of-way lines into your drawing, those come in with this bright green solid color. But basically that glow texture is just producing a solid color which doesn't have a photorealistic texture. So basically the surface of this low poly model is setting that top texture level to a glow of a particular color, whether it's green or black or red or gray, just for a simple non-photorealistic cover. And then as I've shown, there is also for comparison a photorealistic version of that same corridor. And you'll see I've got moving traffic turned on, plus 3D grass and other vegetation assets and light poles and planter boxes. And I've programmed in stop bars for the bus lanes, so those are coming to a stop at those bus shelters in the median. So this project is just an example to show how you can create different levels of detail with Beyond Typicals. In reality, the low poly model is probably more effort to build because by default, the lanes aren't coming in with that glow texture. So you'd have to make those surface texture changes and make sure the colors are matching across the model, which you can do by copying the hex code from under the color wheel and pasting that into the color wheel for other sections. So realistically, a low poly version could counterintuitively take longer than making a photorealistic model with Beyond Typicals, but regardless if it's something that the client wants, those options are here for your use if needed. And finally, here's the wide highway alternatives example project. This one started with some inspiration from hearing that the US DOT awarded the city of Philadelphia with mega grant funding for their Roosevelt Boulevard Route for Change project. I was able to pop open a copy of that master plan and see a couple different typical section alternatives that looked really robust and really made me want to recreate them in Beyond Typicals. So I did that here with the neighborhood boulevard option, which was one of their two alternatives in the plan. You'll see it's a very complete street with some auxiliary lanes and some BRT lanes. There's a park in the middle and raised two-way bike facilities on the outside. So there's a lot going on here, but it was relatively quick to build because a lot of this includes some pretty straightforward section types with just a few custom elements and textures in there. From there, it kind of evolved. As I kept looking at the plan, I saw they had an option that was basically a capped expressway where they were tunneling the arterial type lanes underneath a park in the middle. So I used some of those same Beyond Typicals features from the highway tunnels example project to basically create this concrete box around these lowered lanes using the retaining walls custom section and expanding the stems and footers and adding some additional footers and moving those up to create that rectangular concrete box around the lanes. And then outside of those, I've just raised up all the other sections pretty high. That height differential is more apparent in this third lowered expressway model, which wasn't an alternative from the Roosevelt Boulevard plan, but it was pretty easy to create after I made the capped expressway model, so I've included that here too. So in this model, you can see that these middle lanes are just common lanes and sidewalk down at elevation 0, and all those other outer sections have been raised up to about elevation 24. But back to that capped expressway, you'll notice that I do have earth and grass and trees and sidewalk on top of those lowered common lanes, and that's not as straightforward as it might seem, so I'll show you how all those pieces were built. But for starters, let's go look at the retaining wall custom sections in the hierarchy. This left retaining wall has a stem piece, which makes up that left wall. And then there is another retaining wall custom section in the middle, and I'll toggle those pieces on and off so you can see those elements. This footer piece is just a largely scaled footer in the X direction to get it nice and wide, and I've moved it above the lanes to make the top version of that tunnel. And then I've also got a similarly scaled footer down at the bottom. And finally, I've got another retaining wall custom piece over on the right as a stem to finish off that box. Then I've got an earth layer section with 3 pieces of earth. I'll toggle those off so you can see those. Those pieces have just been scaled and moved to fit the width over the concrete tunnel box I made and sit between the earth under the raised sections outside of those tunneled lanes. And then you'll see that there are a lot of placed assets in the middle of the model. These are generally on those sections that are the lowered lanes, and you'll see that by the triangle icon in the hierarchy. But as I select all of these, you'll see all those beyond typical icons for all those elements that have been placed and moved up above the earth layers. That includes the grass sections, the concrete sidewalk, the trees, and light poles up here. It's a little challenging to make, but not terribly difficult. Basically, if you were to drag in an asset, you would need to place it down on those lowered lanes and move them up. You'll see as I hover over to the left, that automatically adjusts the placement upwards. So alternatively, I could place them up here and move them right or left. But in this example, I placed them down on those lowered lanes and then selected them and moved them up into place within the park space above that capped expressway. So that'll do it for all the new features and example projects in version 2.3 of Beyond Typicals. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to go get the latest patch either at the Epic Games Launcher or by downloading the latest zip folder from beyondware.com/download. As always, if you have any questions about Beyond Typicals or would like to offer feedback, you can either use the Contact Us page on our website or email me at brian@beyondware.com. Thanks for watching.